Good evening. Let me welcome you to the 46th Annual Costa Lecture. I'm Chester Patch. I'm chair of the History Department's Costa Lecture Committee. I have the pleasure and really honor of introducing an outstanding historian who's speaking about an important and timely topic less than 3 weeks before Election Day, right? 19 days. Let me first, though, thank some people who made this event possible. An event like this requires really months of preparation and planning, and a lot of hands went into that work. Among them were Patrick Barr and Victoria Lee, my colleagues on the Costa Lecture Committee, and Brian Shane, the chair of the History Department, who plays just a vital role in everything we do as a department. So I want to thank all of them for their work. I'd also like to acknowledge some special guests here tonight. We're pleased to welcome two members of the Ohio University Board of Trustees, Nancy Hammond and Craig Butler. The Executive Vice President and Provost, Donald Leo, is attending his first Costa Lecture, now in his first year as Provost. And here tonight is the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Matthew Ando. Dean Ando has been here 2 years, and this is his second Costa Lecture. And so I think he's in line for some extra credit attendance points. Maybe like a few of the people in the audience whose teachers might have incentivized their participation. I think I pressed the button that I probably shouldn't have. Let's go back. All kidding aside, though, the presence of some members of the Ohio's leadership team here tonight affirms our collective commitment to what our university is really all about. The advancement of knowledge in the arts and sciences and the exchange of stimulating ideas in inclusive communities. That's what Ohio University is all the time, tonight and every night. There's somebody who we also celebrate at each Costa Lecture. That's Helen Coast Hayes, whose generosity made this lecture series possible. She was a member of Ohio University's class of 1926. She envisioned the Costa Lecture as a way of contributing to the intellectual dialogue that she enjoyed participating in for so many years while she was here to do that. She was also so modest, though, that she didn't want the lecture series to bear her name. So she came up with this way of disguising her role, which isn't to disguise it at all. She changed the order of a few letters in her middle name, Coast, and it became the Costa Lecture. There's really nothing that Helen Hayes liked more, and in my first years here, I got a chance to meet her. She was then in her 90s. There's nothing she liked more than a stimulating presentation about a provocative topic that spoke to our contemporary circumstances. So she would have been delighted with tonight's event and tonight's speaker, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt University. Professor Hemmer's CV doesn't show any obvious or direct connections to Ohio University, but I learned about one yesterday, and let me share it with you. Professor Hemmer earned her BA at Marion University in Indianapolis, and she majored in psychology. But she took a history course, and it was so good that she decided to go to graduate school in history. We love to hear stories like that, but there's more to it. Who was the instructor whose course changed her career trajectory? It turns out it was someone named Ray Habersky, who earned his PhD in history, where else? At Ohio University. So there's a lesson here. A history course, especially one taught by an OU professor or an OU PhD, can change your life. And I offer Professor Hemmer tonight as living proof of that argument. So after earning her PhD at Columbia, our guest tonight did some really interesting work in applied history. She joined the Professional Studies Group at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, which has ongoing projects in transcribing and publishing recordings of presidential conversations and also doing oral history interviews with members of recent presidential administrations. She also worked at the Obama Presidency Oral History Project at Columbia University for a time. For the past 3 years, she's been a professor of history at Vanderbilt, director of the Carolyn T. and Robert M. Rogers Center for the American Presidency. She teaches courses on the Obama presidency, the United States in the 1990s. Yes, that's history now, even though it may seem recent to some of us, and conservatism in America since 1945. Her books have established her reputation as a leading scholar of conservative media and conservative politics during the last half of the 20th century and the early 21st century. Her first book, Messengers of the Right, explores how a generation of conservative writers, publishers, and broadcasters helped reshape Republican politics and maybe American politics even more broadly in the 1950s and 1960s. Her most recent book is Partisans, the conservative revolutionaries who remade American politics in the 1990s. And it shows how an influential group of political leaders and their media allies remade conservatism and turned it into something very different than the optimistic Americanism of Ronald Reagan that seemed so durable in the 1980s. She argues that Newt Gingrich, Pat Buchanan, Rush Limbaugh, and Laura Ingraham all had a big influence in creating the polarizing politics that we know all so well today. In addition to her work as a scholar and a teacher, Nicole Hemmer has a parallel career in public engagement. If you haven't read her books, maybe you know her opinion pieces for CNN, which she writes regularly and has for a number of years. Or you may listen to her podcast that she co-hosts with 2 others. This Day in Esoteric Political History has 300,000 downloads a month. I listened last night to the most recent episode about the history of political advertisements, something I did despite being overwhelmed, like I think many in this room are, with our fill of advertisements for a Senate seat that's up for grabs with 2 candidates who apparently have unlimited budgets and will just keep relentlessly barraging us, but I learned something new nonetheless, and so I encourage you to do the same. Tonight's presentation, Professor Hemmer combines her talent for public engagement with her skill as a scholar as she examines a theme that's become all too common in the last few elections, disinformation, term that we all think about now, but didn't not so long ago, and a way of thinking in conspiratorial terms that's moved from the political fringe to the mainstream. Conspiracy theories are as old, really, as American politics. But there seems something really different about today's toxic mix of disinformation and conspiracy plots. So who better than Nicole Hemmer to help us understand the present by drawing on her knowledge of the past and bringing them together? So please join me in welcoming Nicole Hemmer to Ohio University.
Well, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. Thank you to the Costa Lecture Committee for making today happen. It's just a real delight to be here with you all today. The road to the White House was paved with dead bodies. That was the conclusion J. Evetts Haley drew about Lyndon Johnson's ascendance to the presidency. Haley had had a front row seat to Johnson's rise in the state of Texas. And with Johnson running for election as president in 1964, Haley believed it was his duty to expose Lyndon Johnson before the American people made their choice. And he laid out his case in a self-published book called A Texan Looks at Lyndon. Now, readers didn't need to crack the cover in order to get his point. The subtitle was A Study in Illegitimate Power. But those who did read the 250 or so pages entered a wild underworld where by the end, Johnson had accumulated roughly a dozen corpses. The jury was still out on what role Johnson played in killing off the last person who stood in his way. Of President Kennedy's assassination, Haley only hinted darkly, "What a strange coincidence." A Texan looks at Lyndon could be dismissed as a run-of-the-mill electoral season conspiracy tract, except for one thing. In the summer and fall of 1964, it sold 7 million copies. And it wasn't alone. 2 other self-published paperbacks appeared that season. In None Dare Call It Treason, John Stormer claimed that America was losing the Cold War to the Soviet Union not because of Soviet dominance, but because of subversion from within. He argued that the State Department, not the Kremlin, had fomented every communist revolution of the 20th century, including Russia's. He wrote, "Every communist country in the world literally has Made in the USA stamped on it." Nor were these traitors just abetting communists abroad. American leaders, manipulated by communist spies, were also quietly selling their own people into slavery to the Soviets, ensuring that within a generation, every American would be either red or dead. Once the takeover comes, he told his readers, you, like millions of others, can be slaughtered like diseased animals or worked to death in slave labor camps or brothels for the Red Army. By Election Day, he had sold 6.8 million copies. And Phyllis Schlafly, a conservative activist from Illinois, followed suit with a choice, not an echo. About a group of secret kingmakers who had sold out the Republican Party, she sold a paltry 3 million copies of her book. Those eye-popping numbers, some 16 or 17 million copies of these books circulating before the election, reflected not just an appetite for conspiracy literature, but the power and the profit-making potential such books had when combined with political campaigns. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, the relationship between campaigns and conspiracies, and particularly the way that since World War II, the right and the Republican Party have grown increasingly dependent on conspiracies during campaigns. The integration of conspiracy theories into electoral politics has significant consequences, both for the US and for democracy more broadly. They have weakened the legitimacy of the electoral process, leaving millions of Americans skeptical about election outcomes. And they have fueled an upsurge in political violence. And this culminated in 2021 with the attack on the Capitol, an event driven by politicians who leveraged a conspiracy theory about the 2020 election and a conspiracy movement called QAnon. And it ended a durable tradition of peaceful transfers of power in the United States, a tradition that hasn't yet been clearly reestablished. So as we get started, I want to clarify a couple of things about conspiracy theories. And first, this was hinted at by Professor Patch, conspiracy theories have been part of the US electoral landscape for most of the country's history. Conspiracy theories are titillating and occasionally frightening, and that makes them pretty useful for mass elections in a two-party country. And second, I'm focusing on the right and the Republican Party today because conspiracy theories have been much more central to their electoral strategies than they have been for the Democratic Party. But in doing so, I'm not suggesting that there is something inherently different about conservatives, that there's something psychologically or pathologically distinct about the right. Rather, I want to offer a more rationalist argument. Conspiracy theories can convey real material and political advantages to a movement and a party. They can motivate activists and voters, sow suspicion about political opponents, and they provide a mental schema that provide ready answers to explain electoral losses. And they come with risks, of course. For one, if you offer the wrong explanation for an electoral loss, it becomes much more difficult to fix that problem. And when conspiracies escape in-group settings and they're exposed to the wider world, they can make it pretty easy to dismiss their adherents as kooks, people that you don't want to be in coalition with. Do you want to be in a coalition with a QAnon shaman, or do you want to have a kind of more mainstream party that you're part of? But as I'll show tonight, the right has figured out some ways to minimize or counter some of those risks while amplifying the advantages of conspiracy theorizing. And while there absolutely are people who are radicalized or damaged because of their belief in conspiracy theories, as a whole, I want to argue that it's more useful to think of conspiracy theories as part of a political strategy rather than evidence of some mental deficiency. Conspiracy theories have become increasingly unpopular in elections, not because people have collectively lost their minds, but because they have found something valuable in them. All right, so to start this particular story about the right and conspiracy theories, I want to take us back to the dawn of the Cold War. So the Cold War wasn't the start of the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, nor was it the start of conspiracy theories about the communist overthrow of America. That goes back basically to the Russian Revolution. But the early years of the Cold War were fertile ground for the kind of conspiratorial thinking that would shape election rhetoric in the United States in the 80 years since. The conservative movement in the United States entered the early Cold War years in a state of flux and frustration. Conservatives didn't feel good about their place in the US political system. Many of them had been activists who opposed US intervention in World War II, and because of that opposition, they felt they had been shut out by many of the major institutions in the United States. They didn't feel like there was a space for them in universities or in media or even in the two major parties. And after the war, they remained convinced that they were facing this kind of political and media and social blackout. Except now they had a new reason. It wasn't their opposition to World War II, but it was a massive communist conspiracy operating within the United States. And to understand how this played out in elections, we have to go to 1952, to the Republican primaries. Going into this race, Senator Robert Taft, who's the guy in the glasses here, Mr. Republican, seemed to be the party favorite. And for conservatives, this was such an exciting moment. He may have been called Mr. Republican, but to them, he was Mr. Conservative. He was the standard bearer for their ideas and their policies. He was a big believer in the kind of right-wing nationalism that this early conservative movement embraced. He had been in the mix for the Republican nomination in both 1940 and in 1948, but in each instance, someone who represented the more liberal wing of the party had won. But in 1952, the path seemed clear for Taft's ascendance, until Dwight Eisenhower entered the race. So Dwight Eisenhower believed that Taft, who opposed US involvement on the world stage, would cede the global order to the Soviets. So he decides to run against Taft for the Republican primary. He hadn't even really been a Republican before that. He was a big national celebrity. He'd kind of stayed out of politics. But because he saw this threat in Taft, he decides to run for the Republican primary, and it leads to one of the bitterest nomination fights in party history. If you know anything about the 1950s, you know that Eisenhower won that fight. And conservatives nursed deep resentment over Taft's loss. This was the third time that the nomination, they believe, had been stolen from him. Now, that's not unusual. Political battles tend to create bad blood. In right-wing magazines like National Review and Human Events, writers moaned about the unfairness of the primaries, suggesting that there had been behind-the-scenes dirty dealings, that delegates had been bought off with foundation grants, offers of car dealerships. And again, so far so normal. That's how politics works. But then the Eisenhower victory mingled with rising fears of communist infiltration. Many people in the conservative movement, most in the conservative movement, sided with Senator Joseph McCarthy, who believed there was a massive communist conspiracy in the US government that had been covered up by both Democratic and Republican administrations dating back to Franklin Roosevelt. And when it came to Eisenhower, this was a tough case to make. Again, Eisenhower was one of the country's biggest celebrities, and he had helped lead the fight to defeat the Nazis in World War II. It was hard to smear him as something other than a patriot. But there was one man who finally managed to connect all the dots. A candy manufacturer from Massachusetts named Robert Welch. So Bob Welch had made his fortune in confections. You'll find his products in your Halloween haul this year, things like Sugar Daddies and Junior Mints. But in 1956, around the time of Eisenhower's re-election campaign, Welch retired to spend the rest of his life exposing the communist conspiracy in the United States. And his main target was Dwight Eisenhower. Welch, like many other conservatives, believed that Eisenhower's nomination had been, as he put it, the dirtiest deal in American political history. But then he went further, arguing that Eisenhower himself had been actively colluding with communists to sell America out. In a lengthy manifesto that he wrote, he said that Dwight Eisenhower is a dedicated, conscious agent of the communist conspiracy. And he went on to add that that observation, as he put it, is based on an accumulation of detailed evidence so extensive and so palpable that it seems to me to put this conviction beyond any reasonable doubt. Upon this worldview, Robert Welch built the John Birch Society. And in the late 1950s and early 1960s, it was this robust group of activists on the right who were both important grassroots conservatives and people who believed that Welch was right. This conspiracy theory about internal subversion and Eisenhower's role in it was central to their worldview. Now, for a growing conservative movement, and it's really in the late 1950s and the early 1960s that the modern conservative movement is coming together. For this movement, the members of the John Birch Society were the backbone of their newly organized political movement. And the John Birch Society members fit so well because not all conservatives bought into this idea that Eisenhower was a dedicated conscious agent of the communist conspiracy, but they did invite conspiratorial thinking. That's because the conservative worldview in the 1950s and 60s went something like this. The American people were naturally in line with conservative ideas, but they were prevented from expressing their true conservatism because liberals controlled all the major institutions of society. They brainwashed Americans in schools and through media and denied them a conservative option in presidential races. And that was the case, they believed, up until 1964. So that is the year when Barry Goldwater won the nomination for the Republican Party and offered the nation a chance for a choice, not an echo, a chance for a choice between liberalism and conservatism. So Barry Goldwater was a very conservative senator from the state of Arizona. His politics were kind of inflected with that southwestern libertarianism of his home state. And he was often the guy who, if there was ever a 99-1 vote in the Senate, that was Barry Goldwater. He was happy to be the one man standing alone. And that sort of principled stand made him a darling of the new conservative movement. And in 1964, he was challenging a pretty expressly liberal president in Lyndon Johnson. Now, the Goldwater case is a really important one for conspiracies and campaigns. As we talked about at the beginning, conspiracy literature was everywhere. And the John Birch Society was pushing hard for Goldwater. And in a way, these conspiracy systems operated as a substitute campaign, providing campaign literature and boots-on-the-ground activists at a time when Barry Goldwater wasn't doing a great job of running the actual campaign. But that created some problems. So the Birch Society was a semi-secret society with private membership roles. But by 1961, enough journalists had kind of sniffed out what it was, that it was basically all they could write about. And why wouldn't they? I mean, there's something irresistible about a secret society run by a candy maker, spreading conspiracies about the president in a long manifesto that Time magazine called Welch's Mein Kampf. And Time went on to say, this could be dismissed, right? Like, this is the kind of thing that you could just kind of make fun of and move on from. Except for one thing, the Birch Society couldn't just be dismissed, because by the early 1960s, it had somewhere between 50 and 100,000 members. So journalists, after running out of things to write about the Birch Society, it's hard to create a lot of content from a secret society, journalists turned their attention to the broader ecosystem of the far right. In the New York Times Magazine, a journalist named Alan Barth outlined the distinguishing characteristics of this new far right: uncomplicated, conspiracy-minded, anti-democratic. And yet, despite these kind of scary qualities, Barth saw little to fear in an organized right. Now, this is what he wrote at the time. "The right may make itself a nuisance, but it will not make itself into a government. It is not a wave of the future. It is a voice of frustration and despair, a wail from an irrecoverable past." Obviously, he was wrong about this, but it touched on something that worried conservatives at the time. They thought it was unfair that media outlets tarred conservatives as crackpots and radicals. But however unfair they thought it was actually pretty effective. And it seemed to them that the cause of all of this trouble for conservatives was the John Birch Society. As one writer at the conservative magazine National Review had to say, "The write-up Time gives the John Birch Society now makes it a nationally known rather than parochial embarrassment. Naturally, nothing would please the left more than to be able to equate conservatism with this breed. I think the moment has come when the magazine must publicly dissociate itself from them." But it turned out that that was kind of a hard ask because Birchers were a big part of their subscriber base. The magazine inched away from Welch, but couldn't bring itself to denounce Birchers outright. And the Goldwater campaign faced the same dilemma in 1964. Goldwater had never been a member of the Birch Society, but he had shared a stage with Robert Welch, and he certainly had a lot of supporters who were Birchers. And that created a problem. The Johnson campaign repeatedly attacked Goldwater as too radical and too unhinged to be president. In fact, during the Goldwater campaign, the big slogan for Goldwater was, "In your heart, you know he's right." And the answer to that from Democrats was, "In your guts, you know he's nuts." So this didn't sit well with Goldwater, and it made him a little wary of the Birchers because he saw the Birchers as playing right into the Johnson team's hand. So the Goldwater campaign tried to distance itself from its more conspiratorial supporters. And yet they forged ahead, even without being welcomed into the campaign, helping to circulate the conspiracy paperbacks along with flyers, brochures, and newsletters. And when Election Day rolled around, Goldwater lost in a historic landslide. And that led to a bit of a reckoning on the right. It wasn't nearly as total as many historians think. There were plenty of conservative leaders and voters who retained their appetite for conspiracy and their support for groups like the John Birch Society. But in the relationship between the conservative movement and the Republican Party, the more conspiratorial factions were relegated to the fringes for the next few decades. And during that period, Republican presidential nominees, allied with an increasingly mainstream conservative movement, won major landslides in 1972, and 1980, and 1984, and 1988. And conspiracy theories still emerged from time to time, especially around things like Watergate. There were conservative supporters of the Nixon administration who were convinced that the entire Watergate affair was orchestrated by Democrats and liberal media outlets to overturn the will of the silent majority. Throughout this decade, there were plenty of people at the margins who kept the conspiracy content flowing. But Republican victories provided poor soil for their project. The thing is, the ground was fallow, not abandoned. And when Republicans lost to Democrat Bill Clinton in 1992, a new era of conspiracy politics followed. There were substantial differences in the political culture that developed by the 1990s that I think are worth talking about before we get into the nitty-gritty of the Clinton conspiracies. First, over the course of the 1980s, scandal became the coin of political journalism. This emerges in part from the role that journalists played in uncovering the Watergate crimes, which opened up this new era of intensive investigative journalism. But it also came from the tabloidization of politics in the 1980s. We can date this to roughly 1988, when Colorado Senator Gary Hart emerged as the frontrunner for the Democratic presidential nomination. Hart had a tendency to date women who were not his wife. And yet when he was questioned about his womanizing, he offered a challenge to journalists. He said, "Follow me around, I don't care. I'm serious, if anyone wants to put a tail on me, go ahead. They'll be very bored." Well, they put a tail on him, and they were not very bored at all. In fact, they were the opposite of bored, because they quickly uncovered tons of evidence of Hart's relationships in a story that would ultimately end his presidential aspirations. That's a pretty consequential scandal, and so the fall of Gary Hart encouraged even more investigations into the private lives of politicians. Now, presidents before this had clearly had really messy private lives, but it was something that journalists and people in power had kind of agreed, we're not going to talk about it. Once the dam broke with Gary Hart, it was a free-for-all. Both the personal and the pecuniary would be fodder for parties and the press going forward. Now, the other major change worth pointing to in the 1990s was the rapidly shifting media landscape. The 1990s saw the massive expansion of cable news and talk radio, as well as the early days of the internet. In this new world, conservative media became both popular and profitable. The bellwether for the rise of this new generation of right-wing media was Rush Limbaugh. So Rush Limbaugh has been dead for a few years now, but for 30 years, he was a fixture in the American political landscape. He had started as a disc jockey and a sportscaster, but in the 1980s, he took a decidedly political turn. And he became so popular with his political radio show in Sacramento that in 1988, he was syndicated nationally. And he became an instant phenomenon. No one had ever seen anything like it. By the time of the 1992 election, Limbaugh had amassed tens of millions of listeners. He had 2 best-selling books, a new syndicated television show. His show mixed political chat and listener calls and conspiracy theories, and it became a critical node of the conservative movement and the Republican Party in the 1990s. His connection to conservative voters seemed so strong that Republican leaders turned to him to sort of sway their voting base. So much so that George H.W. Bush, caught in the intensity of the 1992 campaign, invited Limbaugh to stay the night at the White House, hoping to win Limbaugh's endorsement. With Republican politicians newly solicitous of conservative media, the ties between right-wing media and the party grew. And that created a kind of pipeline between the conspiracy theories bouncing around in talk radio and the people who held power in Washington. Now, the Clinton years provided plenty of fodder for this new scandal-driven, conspiracy-mongering media atmosphere. Part of that is on Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton offered up a lot of raw material, primarily in his personal life, but also because of the casual corruption and cronyism of state politics in Arkansas, where he was governor. Now, the accusations against Clinton on the corruption front, which were deeply investigated, rarely amounted to much. But he had made a lot of enemies on his path to the White House, and those enemies found ready audiences in the new media environment of the decade. The scandal machinery was already spinning up in the first year of Clinton's presidency. Its core was a monthly magazine called The American Spectator. It sat at the center of a web of anti-Clinton activists, Republican politicians, and conspiracy-minded media. A billionaire named Richard Mellon Scaife, whose vast fortune flowed throughout the conservative movement and Republican Party, funded the magazine's work and also funded something called the Arkansas Project, which was about trying to find or create scandals and conspiracies around Clinton. And some of the stories the magazine pursued were just straightforward political stories, questions about the Clintons' real estate deals, their hiring and firing decisions in the White House travel office. But they also pursued other, darker conspiracies, that were eagerly gobbled up by a base hungry for increasingly shocking and salacious stories about the Clintons. And one such conspiracy theory involved the death of Vince Foster, who was a longtime friend of both Bill and Hillary Clinton and a colleague of Hillary Clinton's in Arkansas. Foster served in the administration as deputy White House counsel, and he really struggled in his time there with depression and anxiety after moving to Washington. His family was still back in Arkansas, and after several mini scandals at the White House, he was suddenly an object of curiosity to supporters. So he kept appearing in the Wall Street Journal. He was really uncomfortable being in the limelight. On July 20th, 1993, Foster drove to Fort Marcy Park in Virginia, where he died by suicide. He was just 48, and he left behind a wife and 3 children. And this was a tragedy. But the deaths also inspired and supercharged the conspiracies around the Clinton. Soon, right-wing media was filled with insinuations that Foster had been murdered because he knew too much about the Clintons' misdeeds. It was a baseless conspiracy. It was investigated by local police, the FBI, 2 congressional committees, and a special prosecutor. Yet it maintained so much traction on the right that it fueled a cottage industry of Foster conspiracy literature. Both Rush Limbaugh and the Wall Street Journal promoted the conspiracy. Limbaugh repeatedly alleged that the suicide scene had been staged and floated the idea that Foster was actually killed in an apartment owned by Hillary Clinton. In July 1995, Republican Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich told reporters he was not convinced that Foster's death was a suicide. Over in the Senate, Bob Dole referred to it as an alleged suicide. The conspiracy even made its way into the formal investigation of Clinton that led to his impeachment. A young lawyer working for Starr named Brett Kavanaugh reinvestigated the suicide for 3 years as part of his work, helping to keep the conspiracy theories about Foster's death alive. Now, one of the people really pushing for the investigation on Vince Foster's death was someone named Chris Ruddy. Ruddy wrote obsessively about Foster's death, so much so that in 1996, he published a collection of essays under the title Vince Foster, The Ruddy Investigation. He followed that the next year with a book called The Strange Death of Vincent Foster, in which he concluded that there were few facts in the Foster case not in serious dispute. He suggested that all the investigations into the case had become part of a larger cover-up. And in 1998, with more funding from Richard Mellon Scaife, Ruddy branched out on his own, starting a new media venture called Newsmax. The Foster conspiracy gave rise to one of the most insidious conspiracies that circulated both during Clinton's 1996 re-election campaign and during Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, the Clinton body count conspiracy. The name derived from a popular website that listed out all of the names of the president and first lady's purported victims. It served as a source for conspiracy videos that became wildly popular on the right during the Clinton years. Some of the most popular were created by a man named Larry Nichols, who was a longtime Clinton enemy from Arkansas, and Pat Mastriania, who created films for fundamentalists on the evils of everything from evolution to gay people to Halloween. Jerry Falwell, who was the founder of the Moral Majority, distributed the films. And the one that caught the most traction was a film called the Clinton Chronicles, which you can see here. It lasts nearly 2 hours. You can go watch it on YouTube tonight if you are so moved. The video spun out every conceivable Clinton conspiracy. Bill Clinton lied about being a Rhodes Scholar. He secretly conducted anti-American business in Moscow. He was part of an international cocaine smuggling ring based out of Arkansas. He got high on his own supply. The film ultimately linked 25 deaths to the Clintons, which they called only a partial list. So the Clinton Chronicles was advertised in right-wing outlets like the Newsweekly Human Events. It was on half-hour infomercials on the old-time Gospel Hour. It initially retailed for $40, plus shipping and handling. That's perhaps why it was also regularly pirated. Before the 1996 election, an estimated 300,000 copies of the Clinton Chronicles were in circulation. and they weren't just in circulation among the right-wing fringe. The Clinton Chronicles was sent to every member of Congress, and it had an ally in Congress who helped to flog it as well. From your neighboring state, Indiana Representative Dan Burton. I'm from Indiana, so I bear the weight of him. Burton was an ardent believer in the Foster conspiracy, so much so that he reenacted how he thought the death had happened in his backyard with a .38 caliber pistol and a melon, something that he detailed in a speech on the House floor. He also went around and introduced Larry Nichols to other Republicans who he thought would be open to some of Nichols' salacious conspiracy theories. So these conspiracy theories weren't just something that were popular among activists and ordinary people, but they were circulated and popularized and investigated in the halls of Congress, in the special prosecutor's office, and they had real staying power. The churn of investigations created an air of suspicion around Clinton, and it fed the politics of polarization, where the goal was to drive up the negatives of the opposition while mobilizing base voters. Those voters, in turn, wanted elected officials to reflect their concerns, including holding investigations into conspiracy theories that took off in right-wing circles. Then the internet happened. So the rise of the internet, combined with the candidacy of Barack Obama, supercharged these dynamics and the links between conspiracies and conservatism. The 2008 election was the first social media election. It featured a new information economy based on shares and trusted messengers that often bypassed traditional media sources. In this space, not only was it easier for conspiracy theories to circulate, but it also became increasingly difficult to distinguish legitimate news sources from others. A post on Twitter or on Facebook looks the same, whether it's coming from the New York Times or coming from a place like InfoWars. And it was in this environment that the birtherism conspiracy was born. It actually began with chain emails, which was kind of a precursor to social media. And from there, it spread across right-wing media. It popped up on blogs, and then in National Review, and then across talk radio and Fox News. The conspiracy theory held that Obama was actually born in Kenya and had falsified much of his history in order to disguise that fact. Being born abroad, he wasn't a natural-born citizen and therefore was ineligible to become president of the United States. And there were plenty of other conspiracies as well, that he was a secret Muslim, that he had failed college. And the Obama campaign responded with an early form of fact-checking. Some of you may remember this. It was the Stop the Smears website that was launched by the Obama campaign, and it would just fact-check and debunk all of the conspiracy theories floating around about Barack Obama. And then the campaign went a step further, and they just released his birth certificate. They were like, what do you want from us? I was born here in Hawaii. But the release of the birth certificate didn't put the issue to rest. As one conservative told Fox News at the time, the campaign has a false, fake birth certificate posted on their website. It's been shown to have watermarks from Photoshop. The man making that claim was Jerome Corsi, who is pictured here. Corsi had first made a name for himself in 2004 when he co-wrote a book called Unfit for Command. The book argued that John Kerry, the Democratic presidential nominee, had lied about his service in Vietnam. It was a national bestseller, and pretty soon after that, Corsi was writing for the conspiracy website WorldNet Daily. WorldNet Daily was one of the sort of leading pushers of the birtherism conspiracy, not just in 2008, but throughout Obama's presidency. They are the sponsors of this billboard. So this had been an issue in 2008, but it was going to be an issue in 2012 as well, because that's when the right returned to the issue of Obama's birth certificate. It's when Corsi began working on a new book called Where's the Birth Certificate? That was meant to be released in the spring of 2011. He was joined in this fight in early 2011 by a new contributor to Fox News, Donald Trump. Flogging the birther conspiracy was Trump's way of relaunching his political ambitions, and it helped him to grow his support within the Republican base. So in April 2011, anticipating that this was going to continue to go on throughout the campaign, Obama released a really long form of his birth certificate as a way of saying, we're done, conspiracies are put to rest. But they don't go away. In fact, the percentage of Republicans who believe the birtherism conspiracy go up in the second term of the Obama administration. And that data point tells us a couple of things. First, conspiracy theories are resistant to fact-checking. That's because conspiracy theories aren't about wrong information. They're a product of a conspiratorial mindset, one that first assumes the conspiracy and then interprets all incoming information through that lens. That allows conspiracy theorists to mobilize the aesthetics of rationalism. So the conspiracy literature of 1964, if you flip through it, heavily footnoted, has all of the sources in the back. Robert Welch, when he was making his accusations, talked about the accumulation of detailed evidence that supported his theory about Eisenhower. And the conspiracy cult QAnon, which I'll talk about more in a moment, uses the slogan, "Do your own research." The problem is not a lack of information that counters the conspiracy, but rather the way the incoming information is reinterpreted through the lens of that conspiracy. And then second, support for conspiracy theories doesn't necessarily signal a deeply held belief in the conspiracy theory. As conspiracy theories have become more integrated into Republican politics, support for conspiracy theories has become a way of signaling in-group identity. And also, frankly, kind of a middle finger to fact checkers and journalists and polling outlets. Like, you're gonna say that he was born in the United States? I choose not to believe you. And so it becomes this way of reinforcing a style of politics rather than signaling, again, a deeply held belief. That integration of conspiracy theories and Republican politics reached its height with the election of Donald Trump. Having re-entered politics on the birtherism conspiracy, he found that conspiracy theories actually served a number of his purposes. They titillated conservatives intrigued by his candidacy, offended liberals, riled up journalists, and became a kind of loyalty test for supporters. After the 2016 election, when he won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote, it was used to claim another victory. Trump regularly claimed that 3 to 5 million people illegally voted in California, robbing him of his rightful popular vote triumph. Conspiracy theorists took note of this dynamic around the Trump campaign, and they flocked to his side, where they were welcomed with open arms. Take the case of Alex Jones. Jones is a longtime host of InfoWars, which is a conspiratorial media platform. He has over time promoted conspiracies about the New World Order, the 9/11 attacks, the massacre of school children. And in 2015 and 2016, he allied with the Trump campaign. So one of the regulars on his network was Roger Stone, who was also one of Trump's right-hand men, and Jones and Trump were in contact throughout the 2016 campaign. And as a result, something interesting happened. So I was doing an interview back in 2016, and somebody asked me about Alex Jones. Isn't Alex Jones part of the conservative media that you study? And I was like, I mean, not really. He's so far on the fringes. But something was happening that was moving him into sort of the mainstream or the more popular conservative movement. These days, you can find him as a guest on shows hosted by Glenn Beck and Tucker Carlson. For Jones, not only was the Trump campaign a pipeline for his conspiracy theories, but they were a path toward building legitimacy for his ideas on the right. Jones was also an early contributor to the QAnon conspiracy, which emerged during the first years of the Trump administration. I think October 2017 is when the first Q drop happened. QAnon is a complex conspiracy that argued a cabal of Satanists and child molesters, some of the most powerful people in the country, were arrayed against Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was getting ready to expose a major plot to take them out. They had a strong electoral component to this conspiracy as well. They believed that no matter what, Donald Trump would be able to defeat his enemies and remain in power. After Trump lost the 2020 election, the conspiracy became increasingly baroque, And QAnon believers anticipated the arrest of Joe Biden and the installation of Donald Trump at any point between the election and the inauguration. In fact, there was a big kind of watch party for the inauguration because they really did expect that at noon, when Joe Biden raised his hand to take the oath of office, he was going to be arrested and Donald Trump would remain president. That conspiracy played neatly into the hands of the Trump team, which spent the run-up, as you know, between the election and inauguration, spreading the biggest conspiracy theory of the Trump years, that the 2020 election had been stolen from Donald Trump, the rightful winner. And while the particulars were developed in response to the conditions of the election, it built on decades of conspiracy theorizing as a mode of politics on the right. Only in 2020, the conspiracies didn't just result in mass book sales or a motivated voting base. It led to mass violence and an insurrection at the US Capitol and an end to the tradition of peaceful transfers of power. And that's why this history of campaigns and conspiracies matter. Conspiracy theories pollute the information environment, diminish faith in democracy, and fuel political violence. Relegating them back to the fringes requires more than just debunking or fact-checking. It means building more dependable and relevant media, stronger and healthier communities, and ultimately, a more resilient and more responsive democracy. That is a generational project. That's not something that happens overnight. But it is the only way to decouple conspiracies from mainstream politics. And to my mind, there is no more worthwhile project. Thank you. And I think we have time for Q&A, so we have these microphones up here at front.
There are a couple of microphones. I can use one here, you can use one there. If not, just please speak up loudly, and Professor Hemmer will repeat the questions, but she'd love to respond. Go ahead, Art.
The demise of newspapers in America, with all of the news people, with the cities, counties, they knew what was going on and reported it. And that demise, it seems to me, raises the duty of universities more than ever to teach critical thinking, to question what's in the news media and on the internet. It's something that, and it's not just universities, it's the entire educational system. And it's so easy to say it, and it's so difficult to implement.
Right.
And that's why colleges and arts and sciences are so important.
So we're getting a fundraising pitch here. No, so the question or the comment is about the demise of local media and the role of educational institutions, including universities, to teach critical thinking. And that is absolutely part of the equation, and it is not the entirety of the equation. Critical thinking skills are absolutely necessary. Critical thinking skills in the absence of information about what's happening locally is actually not enough, right? Because one thing that local newspapers did, even though they weren't perfect, but they provided a kind of friction between conspiracy theories and people because there was a trusted source of information in the community. But local news also fosters a sense of community and a sense of connection to the people around you. And that sense of connection and community and belonging is actually a kind of inoculation against conspiracy theorizing. It doesn't do away with them, of course, but it is helpful as one of the preconditions. And when it comes to universities, absolutely critical thinking is a strong part of this, but so is dedicating universities to the project of a stronger and healthier democracy and stronger and healthier communities. So the relationship between a university and the local community is just as important because it models kind of an ideal way for society to act that, again, provides a kind of inoculation against some of these conspiracies and keeps them from taking off.
So, how would you categorize I asked you this as a fellow Democratic Party member, but the
So the question is about the story of Russia's involvement in the 2016 election, the collusion with the Trump campaign and the Trump administration, and how that fits in to conspiracy theories. I think that it is a both and. That there is, first of all, there's both evidence of Russian involvement in the 2016 election, connections between the Trump campaign and the Russian government, and there have been conspiracy theories that have grown out of that. I think that the difference is that those have been fairly central to some Democrats in their understanding of the world. I don't think that they have become as totalizing for the Democratic Party as conspiracies have for the Republican Party, but I think it's something to watch for because, again, my focus here was on conspiracy theories in the right, but that's not exclusive to the right. And I actually think it can be a problem when really simplistic conspiracy theories, like every bad thing that happens because of Russian involvement and Russian trolls. That doesn't give you an accurate map of the universe. It also absolves Americans of their responsibility for their own political climate. Russia didn't lead to the outcome of the 2016 election. Americans voting led to the outcome of the 2016 election. And it's why we were back there in 2020 and why we were back there in 2024. And so if you have the wrong answer for why things are happening, your solutions aren't going to be very good. So I think that it is a danger to indulge in conspiracy thinking, and I think that we should judge media outlets harshly who indulge in it.
I was wondering if we could also make a comparison as well. I definitely feel that the QAnon, a lot of QAnon conspiracies do have elements of blood libel as well. I remember being a young boy in 2014, early teenager, I was 14 years old, and I remember like a lot of the QAnon websites would blame a lot of the issues that America was facing on so-called Judaism, so to speak, as I can recall.
So the comment was about to paraphrase it, the role of anti-Semitism in QAnon, that it has aspects of blood libel, and it has like literal aspects of blood libel, like eating children, which is the original blood libel involved in anti-Semitism, is a core component of the QAnon conspiracy theory. And one of the things that's important about that observation is, it's also a reminder that conspiracy theorizing has had a body count long before recent history, right? That the conspiracies, the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that have shaped much of I could start at the 18th century, but it actually goes back much further than that, have led to a tremendous amount of violence. And to see those repackaged and recreated, you don't necessarily look at QAnon immediately and think blood libel because of the way that a lot of it is coded, but it uses the exact same tropes as anti-Semitic, as the protocols.
Well, I also feel like it's important to mention the differing sorts of fascism that are thrown out of this too. So it's almost as if you have like two wings of fascism. You have an American neo-Nazism that is closer to the fascism of the Weimar Republic, and then you sort of have a new fascism that grows out of capital, correct? And that is like pro-Zionist and is not necessarily anti-Semitic, but is more prejudiced against Islam as opposed to Islam. And you have a wing of fascism that is opposed to Jews and is against Jews. So I think it's important to recognize QAnon as well as the different branches of fascism that has created and that grow off of it.
And I'm just going to paraphrase again so that we have it for the recording, but his comment is about the role of various religious prejudices and hatred in a variety of different fascisms that have emerged of late. So, back here.
Yeah, I want to follow Alex's question, actually, which is that I wanted to ask, clearly you think that there's some sort of rational use to these conspiracy theories. Therefore, assuming that Democrats are also rational actors for Republicans, there's some sort of probably sociological explanation as to why they're not using conspiracy theories so much. I would like to ask your opinion on that. But relatedly, I would also like you to, if you can, kind of defend this heuristic of conspiracy theories
Right, right, and that, sorry, I'm going to try to paraphrase. So the first question was about, sorry, could you say it again really quickly?
Yes, the first question is, since you think it's rational or a rational employment of a tool to use these conspiracy theories, why do you think Democrats don't use it or are less inclined to use it?
So because it's an effective tool to use conspiracy theories, why don't Democrats do it? And I think that as much. And I think that part of it has to do with kind of the political argument that conservatives have embedded in their movement since the 1940s and 50s. And this idea of being people who deserve to be at the top of social and economic and political systems and having been shut out of them in their experience, that there was a system arrayed against them that led to their oppression. So that's part of it. And part of what grows out of that is the development of conservative media. And the logic of conservative media is that you should evaluate your sources of information based on their ideology first. So if you know that a source is conservative, you know it's trustworthy. And if a source is liberal, then you should be very suspicious of it. And that actually creates the ability for conspiracy theories to flow a little bit more easily because of where it puts the sort of assessment of trust. And then the second question, just a quick paraphrase.
A little more shortly or more succinctly, what is the justification for looking at conspiracies as failure
Right, instead of structural. Great. Yeah, so the question is, why think of it in terms of conspiracy theories that people hold instead of the institutions that support them? And I think that this too is a both and I think that because the solutions are structural, that we should think of conspiracy theories in this way as structural, right? Like there are reasons that conspiracy theories thrive. There are reasons people believe in them. I don't want to take agency away from people who use conspiracy theories because a lot of those people answering the polls about birtherism were choosing to answer those polls that way because they thought that it signaled something important and it empowered them in a certain way. So, you know, it's a mutually constituted politics that we're talking about. But absolutely, there's a enormous role being played institutionally, and that's part of the reason it has such staying power is because it's embedded institutionally in so many of the organizations and institutions of the right.
Do you believe that people who originally tout these kinds of conspiracies are doing so in good faith, I suppose, like they genuinely believe that, or are they using it more so as a tool to further their own liberalism, rally development?
It's a real mixed bag. There are certainly people who are true believers. And I look at somebody like Alex Jones, who sort of sits right in between the two. There are some things that he definitely believes, and he is also selling you something. And he's making a lot of money selling you something. And you can sometimes see the seams between what he professes and what he actually thinks. There are absolutely people using them cynically. And then there are people who maybe didn't even start off as true believers that get there. Like it's even possible for leaders of these movements to be radicalized. And I think about people like Michael Flynn, who was part of the Trump administration, who's become a big QAnon figure. And when I see him operating, I kind of think he believes it. Ultimately, it doesn't matter, but ultimately it doesn't matter for our politics. But it's a fascinating question, and it's something we always go around when we think about any kind of political belief. How much of it is being used sort of tactically, and how much of it is a deeply held belief. And it is often very, very hard to tell. Every once in a while, you'll get somebody's text messages, and then you'll know what Tucker Carlson thinks of the people who he's preaching to. But without that kind of really stark evidence, it can be hard to discern.
What role do you think socioeconomic status plays in the adoption of conspiracy theories? And then when you couple that with Hillary Clinton referring to people back home where I come from as a basket of deplorables, and how those kinds of perceptions intersect and influence the adoption of conspiracy theories.
This is a great question, too. It's about the role of socioeconomic status in conspiracy theories. I mean, the interesting thing about conspiracy theories is it's not necessarily limited to a particular class or a particular level of education. Some of the people who I think about when I think about like the QAnon conspiracy, Trump's lawyers, people who went to law school, like Sidney Powell, believe or promote the QAnon conspiracy. So I think that I don't think that it's necessarily a class issue. I haven't looked at the breakdown of it in polls, but it seems to me something that is accessible to people across the class spectrum, in part because, educational attainment, instead of being a barrier to belief in conspiracy theories, can in fact help somebody fall even deeper down that rabbit hole, because they believe that they understand the logics and the ways to find evidence and to do their own research, and then they do all of those things. But because they've come into it with a conspiratorial framework, everything they find just reinforces what they've already seen. So I should dig into more about where the class lines fall on this, but I don't think that it's as clear cut as it might seem on the surface.
Do you think that the left spreading some of their misinformation or disinformation in the media has any responsibility for the increase in conspiratorial thinking on the right?
Well, I think that the conspiratorial thinking on the right has much deeper roots. And so I don't think that that is a major driver of it. I think in some ways the success of conspiratorial thinking on the right has actually been a bit of a driver of some of the turn to different tactics on the left. Again, we don't see the same level of conspiracy theorizing or disinformation among Democrats or among the left, although it's absolutely there. So there's definitely an interplay, but in most cases, especially now, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives operate in such distinct media circles and information circles that I'm not sure there's a strong feedback loop between the two. So that's my sort of first stab at it.
What do you think about the idea that a lot of people think that the left controls the mainstream media? Do you think that can have an effect on conservatives feeling they're being oppressed by the mainstream media and feeling like they're oppressed what they've been talking about?
So, sorry, I keep forgetting to say the question. So the question is that belief that the left controls the mainstream media one of the things that's driving conspiracy theories on the left, or sorry, on the right? Yes. I mean, I think that's one of the core foundational beliefs of Cold War and post-Cold War conservatism, that media outlets are run by liberals and are run by liberals to promote liberal ideas. Right, so conservative media outlets in the 1950s and 1960s looked at outlets like the New York Times that said that they were objective. And liberals and conservatives looked at that and they said, no, you're pretending to be objective. Objectivity is a mask you wear in order to slip in your liberal beliefs and sort of brainwash the American people to those beliefs. And that's sort of how conservative media gets built, because it's a rejection of those liberal media. So I think that's absolutely a part of it, and it has those deep historical roots. And that's part of the reason why conservative media is so much bigger than a kind of overtly ideological liberal media, because they've been building it for so long.
You talked about kind of not just fact-checking can put kind of conspiratorial thinking back on the fringes. What do you have to say about kind of groups that will self-admittedly say that they operate on the fringes? And as we can see in the picture, obviously these smaller fringe groups often admit that they are willing to use violence. And what do you have to say to just kind of smaller groups that kind of embrace all of that?
Right, so the question is about what do you do about groups that don't mind being on the fringes? And that has always been a source of potential political violence in the United States. Fringe groups across the political spectrum who see violence as an important political tool that they can use. But those groups become more empowered when they're attached to a major political party, when they have the support of political leaders. You don't get this if you just have a fringe group like QAnon or America First. It has to also have the backing of either the state or of major mainstream institutions, and that's what folks here had.
Do you see this kind of trend in places other than America? Like, is this specific to American conservative politics, or is this common in, like, on an international conservative level, like other countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually do see it in many countries where they have explicitly ideological media that does tend to feed conspiracy theories. And in some cases, they're copying one another. Like there is a real flow of ideas about media and arguments about politics and conspiracy theories that flow from the US to Canada to Australia to the UK and to other parts of the world. So it's not just that it's also happening in other countries, but that they are connected in very real ways through people and institutions and interchanges that those different groups have.
Let's make that the last.
Okay, let's do one more.
Yeah, so with the spreading of misinformation being such a problem, do you also see the censorship of legitimate stories as well becoming an equal problem as well?
So the question is about, with misinformation being such a big problem, is the censorship of legitimate stories also a problem? It hasn't been as significant as misinformation. So I think probably the main example that you're thinking about is perhaps the Hunter Biden laptop story.
That's exactly what
I thought that's what you were thinking of. So that idea that because there had been so much misinformation that had flowed through the media ecosystem from 2016 on, when people saw the Hunter Biden story, they didn't, when media institutions saw the Hunter Biden laptop story, they were like, there's no way that this could be true. What, he randomly left his laptop at this one place and Rudy Giuliani got his hands on it? And it's 2 weeks before the election. Like, they took the heuristic that they had and they said, well, this can't be true. And they slowed down the spread. They didn't censor the story, but they slowed down the spread of the story and made it much more difficult to find, although ultimately I think it got amplified even more because of those efforts. It was the wrong move. They made that decision based on the information they had at the time. They probably made the wrong call. And now there I don't think exists the same institutional structures that would allow that to happen a second time. So, I mean, there's a pretty significant instance, an example, but the broader problem of misinformation is at scale, and the timeline of it is much bigger. But that's probably not the right way to solve that problem.
I was going to ask one more question, the ultimate conspiracy question. Who really killed John F. Kennedy?
They cut my mic. Thank you so much.